Coming at you live from the shores of Lake Norman. How's everybody's Memorial Day weekend going?
Oh, it's going great, George. We had a bunch of people over yesterday. My wife's figured out how to make smashed potatoes that vanished in about 30 seconds flat. So things are going well here in DC.
George, they got me down by this dirty little creek, and there's not even any of them big old women they got in San Antonio. And it's terrible.
Terrible, silly knucklehead business. Terrible, Ernie.
Terrible. It's a terrible thing.
Oh, my weekend is going okay. Yesterday, I went to a bar that, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being a nice, respectable place that George would take his wife to, and 10 being a place that Speedrun Enjoyer and I would find ourselves in at 30 minutes to closing time, probably ranks at about a 7. This is a bar where people who I know have been 86'd from other bars in the same neighborhood all end up going. Was having a beers with some out-of-town friends of mine, and then today I went to the Portland International Test Rose Garden.
What is an International Test Rose Garden?
It is a giant rose garden in Washington Park in Portland. It's got about 10,000 individual different rose bushes, many of which compete in international competitions for kind of best rose. And so you get things that go back to the early 1900s. So different types of roses that go all the way back there, as well as all sorts of different newer kind of hybrids.
Speaking of glorious competition level beauty, how are we doing up there, Lowtax? Where are you at?
I am in North Georgia, and I had a good old time nearly rolling my Jeep off the side of a mountain because Georgia and its big, dumb red clay clogged my tires up. But other than that, we're doing great. We made we've been cooking all kinds of food. And just having a good old time by the dirty little creek.
And George, what was going on at the lake?
Brother-in-law and sister-in-law are in from out of town, and we're staying at my mother and father-in-law's place, and we're having a great time. My daughter has her favorite aunt and uncle here, and my wife and I are getting some time away from childcare on a weekend, which is always enjoyable. And they got a nice flat road out here, so I can run a 5K instead of huffing up and down the hills in my neighborhood on something nice and flat, and get to dive in the lake at the end. So I'm pretty happy. I'm doing well.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you were enjoying the flat little road so you could hit the gas on your Lightning.
Well, first of all, there's no gas on the Lightning, of course. Which
well, I know.
Is
yes,
but the big problem with that.
That figure of speech is never going away.
We were driving back from the local state park, and we were listening to one of my country playlists, and the conversation in the car quickly tilted towards, when you're out at the lake, you kind of got to listen to some country, and we do, and we enjoy it. And, a little bombing down a back road in a pickup truck, that's the sort of music you got to be listening to. So a little Morgan Wallen, things of this nature.
George, I'm from Oklahoma. You and I may have very different views on the kind of country you should be listening to.
I'm an equal opportunity country guy. I'm sure there's some good stuff from Oklahoma. I'm not pretending to be some kind of connoisseur here. I just like a little mood music in the background.
You said Morgan Wallen, things of that nature, and now I'm hearing that in the Stephen A. Smith voice because my brain has been destroyed by the internet.
So we're now working on 2 imitations of sportscasters to the start of this podcast. I think we're doing pretty good on that quota today, folks.
I can't do a Stephen A. Smith. It's just not in my powers.
And I'm not going to. And with that, welcome to Normal Men, a podcast from 4 men who are clinging desperately to normalcy in an era when normalcy is impossible to find. We talk about what's happening, explain some of it, and joke with each other in order to stay sane. I'm George in Charlotte.
I'm Proctor Malone from the District of Columbia.
I'm Lowtax Speedrun Enjoyer in outer Florida.
I'm Go Like Hell Machine in Antifa-controlled Portland. So speaking of country music, earlier this week I was talking about owning the favorite vehicle that I've ever owned in my life, which was an '88 Dodge Ram Charger. And one of the things that I mentioned about it was that country music, and specifically AM Gold country music, was the only thing that sounded good in the speakers because the speakers were garbage. The car itself was roughly the size of a tank. It is kind of like OJ's white Bronco, but on human growth hormone. It had glass packs, and if you're not familiar with glass packs make the exhaust to your car sound significantly louder than it would automatically. So my dog, I used to have a basset hound named Maggie. My dog could hear me from 2 miles away and would start barking from 2 miles away. So all of my punk house roommates loved that. This vehicle had a gigantic chrome cattle bar on the front. One of the windows worked, which was fantastic in an Oklahoma summer. The air conditioning did not work.
Are you the most unhinged guy from Oklahoma? Is that what I'm getting from this?
I'm not even in the top 30% of most unhinged people from Oklahoma. So that was my favorite car. One of the most ridiculous cars I ever owned was a lifted Jeep Cherokee that we bought from an ex-girlfriend's brother to help him pay off a child support debt, because in Oklahoma, you're going to lose your license if you haven't paid your child support. Now, to be fair to this guy, he didn't do this on purpose. He just had a lot of hard time finding a job, and he didn't have any money, and he dug himself into a hole.
This is, by the way, probably why Elon has moved Tesla to Texas and not Oklahoma.
But yeah, this was not only was it a Jeep Cherokee, it was a lifted Jeep Cherokee, electric blue on oversized tires that I was using to drive city streets to a call center job.
Cherokees are great trucks. You can always tell what's going to go wrong with them like clockwork. Like 60,000 miles, the water pump is going to break. 120,000 miles, the radiator's going to blow. But to buy a lifted Cherokee used is a level of bravery that I can only aspire to, because I've been around enough of these guys with their lifted brodozers to know that I want no part of that whatsoever.
Jeep Cherokee also has a treasured place in my memories of childhood. We lived about 20 minutes from the local ski hill when I was growing up in Western Canada. And my parents drove a, late 1980s model Dodge Caravan when I was a little kid, when I was about 5 or 6, maybe 7 years old. And I can still remember that Dodge Caravan. And I can also remember driving home from the ski hill one day, and on a relatively straight part of the very steep and twisty road coming down from the ski hill, doing a full donut in this thing, 2-wheel drive, of course. You put snow tires on them, but it doesn't help that much. Managing to avoid the ditch, but still, this was not the car we needed to be driving in the mountains of Western Canada. And my dad, I think the next day, went to the local Jeep dealership to say, I need something with 4-wheel drive. And so we drove a Jeep Grand Cherokee for a while. That Jeep Grand Cherokee had a memorable incident when I was coming home from college one year. We were driving north from the Spokane, Washington airport, which is the nearest decent-sized airport to my hometown, about 3.5 hours south of my hometown. And we're driving around a corner at pretty good speed, and an entire wheel comes off the Jeep Grand Cherokee. Turned out that the tire shop had forgotten to more than hand tighten the bolts on that side of the car, and the whole thing came under torque. I don't think it can be blamed on Jeep, but it was memorable. And the Jeep Grand Cherokee is a venerable vehicle, at least mid 1990s versions in my memory.
So talking about bad cars, Proctor, what's the worst car you ever had?
all the way through college, I drove a 85 Toyota Corolla with a Korean War surplus roof rack that was screwed into the top. It was not the most aerodynamic of roof racks, but I had one particular drive going back down to school. I went to school in Southern California, about a 26-hour drive from where I grew up in Eastern Washington. And I was leaving my hometown in Eastern Washington at the crack of dawn to try to get on the road. And it was snowing, and the plows weren't out yet because it was 4 a.m. And I'm crawling along at about 10 miles an hour when I slowly slide off the road. No big deal. Get a hold of AAA, flag down a cop, get pulled out of the snowbank. I'm back on the road, and I think everything's fine. I go pick up a classmate of mine in Seattle, a brief 6 hours away. She's a New York Times bestselling author now, actually. But at this point, she was a 19-year-old girl, and she was driving, and it was good. The stuff we have on the roof rack starts coming off after we get past Portland. So we have to repack the whole damn car because things are just flying off in the middle of I-5. And then as we get down past Wairika, we run into another problem, which is that apparently I did something to the tires when I slid into a snowbank way back in Eastern Washington. And all of a sudden we've got a flat at 75 miles an hour in the middle of absolutely nowhere in Northern California. I mean, absolutely nowhere. So we're on the side of the freeway and we're waiting for like half an hour before we even see a cop come by to flag down. And we wind up spending the night in this crazy hotel that fortunately we didn't get stabbed in. And eventually, we get back on the road, and the car ran for another solid 4 years after that.
Well, at least it worked out for you. It reminds me of a time that my best friend was driving an 81 Honda, and I cannot remember the actual model, but decided to take us in Oklahoma on New Year's Eve during a freak snowstorm, which Oklahoma doesn't normally get, to this gal's house party for New Year's Eve in the middle of nowhere that turned out to be her, a goth named Storm who spoke in a British accent but was from Sapulpa, Oklahoma, and then, unbeknownst to us when the party started, her boyfriend, which posed a problem for us, given the entire reason that we drove out to the party in the first place was that my best friend wanted to hook up with the girl who was holding the party and also didn't know that she had a boyfriend staying with her. But the funny part of this was, well, all of it was funny, but one of the funny parts was the drive out because he had no heat. So we were driving through a snowstorm with no heat. He's like 19 years old. I'm like 17 years old. Neither of us should be anywhere on the road. It worked out well for him in the end. It was less exciting for me.
There's something very special about the road trip, or not even road trip, but just significant driving breakdown. After college, some buddies and I did a giant circumnavigation of the country in my buddy's Jeep Patriot, I think it was. It was one of these sort of smaller sized Jeep SUVs. It wasn't the Grand Cherokee, but smaller size. And these vehicles are not built for this kind of punishment. We drove from the North Rim of the Grand Canyon to Dallas, Texas in, well, basically one shot. We had 4 guys in the vehicle. My college roommate, a college football teammate, and my brother and me. And we were doing rotating shifts and driving through some of the most desolate but beautiful country in the West. And on, I believe it was I-5, somewhere around a town called Grants, New Mexico, something stopped working. I have never been to a place for less than 3 hours where multiple people suggest I get laid in that town in that span of time. I have never seen a bar, not alcohol sales, a bar in a gas station. For the record, nobody in the car got laid in Grants, New Mexico. No one even tried. We were too dumbstruck with horror. There was a bar inside a gas station. I'm not talking like they sold beer. I'm talking like there were 3 people perched on the bars, chain smoking, drinking rum and cokes in a gas station like checkout area. And I think that's not even the most horrifying thing we saw, which was a tweaker hand stripping copper wire at the place we ended up at trying to fix our car.
Oh, so it's like a Tuesday in Portland.
Yeah, Grants, New Mexico. No offense to the good people of Grants. I'm sure you're out there. We didn't meet any of you on our trip through town, but it was rough.
I bet you can get a pretty ridiculous Frito pie out there.
Oh yeah, I bet so. So we have actually owned a Jeep Patriot in the past, and I'm guessing what happened is one of the little actuators or something got stuck in the transmission, and it probably overheated. Because that happened to us a couple times.
Yes, and then it unstuck itself. We didn't actually need to fix anything. It just unstuck itself. So I think that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, you would just pull over and wait for like 15 minutes, and then it would be fine. But I do want to circle back to Propter. An 80s Corolla with a Korean War era roof rack. Can you describe this for me a bit more? Because
I'm equally curious here.
Yeah, so I don't know how my dad wound up with the roof rack. I assume he bought it surplus or something somewhere along the line. But he'd had it for years. It had gone from vehicle to vehicle as just, your basic giant metal basket that sits on top of a car. It was probably about 16 inches high. Like, this is a serious roof rack, and it's not aerodynamic in any way. Like, this is not like clipping into struts. This is not a roof rack for your outdoor and athletic supplies. This is a roof rack for you to put a whole bunch of suitcases in, and that's what we did.
Weren't you just also telling us that your dad drove the same smaller truck for, like, I don't know, 20 or 30 years?
He was pushing 40 years by the time he finally got rid of that thing. But yeah, dad doesn't move real fast on the automotive side. He tends to pick one and stick with it.
A 16-inch tall basket, isn't that like taller than an 80s Corolla would have been?
So, Lowtax Speedrunner, how many Jeeps have you had? Did you come across your Jeep derangement congenitally, or did you develop this on your own as you became a teenager?
No. So, actually, it developed in my 20s. So I have a buddy who lives in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. And we were living in DC at the time. This would have been probably around like 2009 or 2010. And we drove up to visit him and his girlfriend. And his dad owned a 2008 Wrangler 4-door. And so we drove that around town. He chaperoned us around everywhere. And I was like, this is really cool. And he told us, yeah, it's been in the shop like 50 times since we bought it 2 months ago. It's a complete pile of garbage.
That sounds like a great record for a Jeep.
Yeah. And I was sort of like, I don't care. This is awesome. And so I've owned 3 Wranglers, and we've owned a Patriot.
And one very, very, very well designed Ford SUV.
Oh, yes. That would be the worst car I have ever owned. Now, I'm a bit spoiled because we've had great luck with cars. Knock on wood. Like, I'm hearing you guys breaking down and stuff and rolling into ditches and all that. Like, none of this has ever happened to me. Knock on wood real hard. But where was I going with it? Oh, my wife's Ford Escape. Yes. Where the fuse box did not fit correctly. And so the car would just shut itself down on the road. And so we took it to CarMax, and they had us take it to the Ford dealer. And the Ford dealer says, yeah, you need a new fuse box, but they don't make them anymore, so we're going to total the car. We had owned the car for a grand total of about 3 months. To their credit, CarMax was like cool about it. They bought it back and, gave us our money for what we had paid on our monthly payment and all that. But I was just like, it was only 10 years old. How are there not parts for it anymore? How are you totaling this car?
I guess, so I'm not a driver anymore. I don't drive. I haven't driven in a little while. I have a driver's license, but generally I take the bus or I walk. But one of the things I miss about the Ram Charger that I had was that it had an engine cavity the size of a 2-bedroom house, which is something that I liked about like 70s and 80s sort of sport utility vehicles, though I think sport utility vehicles is kind of a weird way to think about those vehicles when you think about the Costco runs of today.
Yeah, we need to bring the 70s, 80s dad SUV back. We need to stop with this. Like, you look at the atrocities they've put out in recent years, the Jeep Wagoneer and the Ford Explorer, which is now basically a minivan. And the worst offender of all is obviously the Chevy Trailblazer, which they have turned into essentially a Volkswagen Golf. And we need to bring back the big dumb stuff we used to build in this country.
The funny thing is, they're still smaller than something like a Cybertruck, or even any of the regular full size pickup trucks at this point.
It's really interesting to hear Lowtax endorse the concept of the Ford Bronco. I was not expecting this conversation to go that direction.
I'm perfectly fine with the Bronco. They should have put a solid axle on the front end so that it could do real off-roading, and they should have designed a hardtop on it that wouldn't dissolve after sitting in the sun for 5 minutes.
Do those exist?
What, hardtops that don't dissolve in the sun after 5 minutes? Yeah, Jeep's been making them for years.
It would be great if they could make anything else reliable on the car, but
Again,
all right, so
fuse box, 10-year-old car, fuse box, totaled the car. George, that's your Ford, boys.
All right. Well, so it's summer in America, and that means besides lakes and trucks and country music, that unfortunately also means it's time for gun violence and political meltdowns. And we had one here in DC this last week, where we're still getting all of the details on this, but it seems like a young man who was radicalized online as part of the broad left came to DC to kill 2 employees of the Israeli embassy here, who were at the time he shot them, who were leaving an event that was trying to raise money and organize people for relief for Palestinians. We've been, I think, somewhat lucky so far in terms of how much of the war has come home to America from Gaza. We've had, I think it's still single-digit numbers of deaths related to that, but this is one that I think is going to get a lot of attention in weeks to come because it was explicitly political, explicitly an assassination, and it was the kind of stochastic terrorism that we haven't seen coming out of this so far. The deaths to date have been very obvious nutcase deaths or accidents. And this is something different.
I think in general, too, we should specify that the left in this country in the past probably 50 years since the Weather Underground, I think would be fair to say, has a history of very limited, if any, use of violence. And that is not how things are necessarily portrayed by political opponents of the left, but the objective reality is that violence in this country is a right-wing phenomenon, or has been for certainly my entire life and longer. And I don't think that one incident necessarily means a change in that trend. I think I've been involved in some pretty radical left-wing spaces myself, and have never encountered the sort of bloodlust that is, at this point, standard operating procedure for large swaths of the right. I also think that again, just one trend does not make, or one instance does not make a trend. But I also think we need to be cognizant of the fact that this was a person who was avowedly of the left. We cannot say that this person was associated with ideas on the left and was a sort of an off balance person who was attracted to a specific idea but didn't have a broad left politics. No, this person had a broad left politics and chose to express that through violence. And I think, speaking for myself, and I think the other 3 men on this podcast, our politics does not have space for stochastic violence.
No, absolutely. I think that, having grown up in the 90s, watched a lot of explicitly right-wing violence. So you had the Olympic bombings, you had the Tiller assassination, you had this whole litany of explicitly right-wing violence that was explicitly attributed to right-wing causes. What you have seen in more recent years that is often attributed to left-wing violence. And so you can talk about something like the attempted assassination of like Steve Scalise, for example. Or you can talk about, the protests and riots in even more recent years is, I think, harder to exclusively attribute to kind of strictly left-wing politics. This attempted Scalise assassination, that guy had some politics that were maybe left-wing, had a lot of other politics that were just kind of don't map clearly onto any particular ideological structure. Protests or even riots are things that are never going to map very, very clearly to left-wing politics. I think this is a little bit closer, and I worry a lot about how this can be used to sort of weaponize left of the dial politics.
Yeah, I think that one of the major differences between the left and the right in this regard is that I do think that the left wing has generally been less violent, but it's the guns. It's the lethality of the guys in the black bloc who are out there who want to get into street fights. They're not really killing people. They're hitting people, and there's violence there, but not lethal violence, and
it's
really
primarily property. It's primarily property damage.
Yeah. And I mean that has a long tradition in this country, but I think that the WTO protests in the Northwest 25 years ago were a significant flashpoint for that. But on the other side of things, the gun violence has been characteristic of certain parts of the right wing for a long time. That this goes back, guns and explosives go back. So Andy, you brought up the long tradition of right-wing violence, but Oklahoma City is a fairly notable flashpoint there, and that informs a lot of the downstream stuff. And then in recent years, we've had more spree shooters coming out of particularly the manosphere. Has driven a lot of that.
I wanted to go back to something Dr. Hellmachine pointed out, which there is a problematic possibility of this particular act of violence being used against the left as a cudgel. And I think that's a legitimate concern. What I worry more about personally is not the right is going to try and use anything it can against the left. We are always going to have something available for them to use as a cudgel against us. And we can't really control that. And I don't know if it's worth spending large amounts of energy framing one's own political affiliations or actions in the context of how can this be used against me, because anything will be used against you. What I worry about is making sure that the values that I hold dear, the egalitarian and ultimately progressive view of the world, that human beings are worth investing in, that other people might know better about their lives than I do, that every human being deserves nurturing and care and support and a place to thrive. I don't see how that politics is compatible with any view of politics that views killing as the means to the end. I don't see how that's compatible. I think it's also, just to close this out, my sort of tangent here out, I do think, again, to what Mr. Hellmachine said about the black bloc, for instance. I've been in protests where there's black bloc activity. Property crime is not the same thing as going out and shooting two people in cold blood. It's not.
Absolutely.
It's absolutely not. And I do think there is space in a broadly egalitarian and nurturing movement for human potential that doesn't absolutely avow in all circumstances, all property crime, hypothetically, whatever. We don't need that purity test. But I do think saying, if you want to go out and kill people to advance your political project, you are not a part of my political project.
And I guess I would add to that in just asking the question, what did this guy gain? Like, I think all of us have been watching this situation, this completely horrifying situation in Gaza play out over the last year and a half. This guy was radicalized about this conflict, killed these two people in DC. What these are like administrative clerical workers at an embassy.
He did not save one Gazan life. Not one.
Not one. Not one. Like, you're not helping this in any way, pal. And cheering it on, by the way, and all of us have seen some of that on Blue Sky and Twitter. That's not helping either. This is you're not saving any lives there. You can go to hell as far as I'm concerned. This is not what we do.
A thing that I think is, and there's probably, it's worth listening to people who are, I think, better versed kind of in the history here and even in the psychology of it. But I think either George or Proctor mentioned the Weather Underground earlier, and there was kind of a coherent theory of controlled violence leading to social or political change. When you look at kind of the some of the political violence that you saw in the 1960s or the 1970s, this is, I think, kind of different in meaningful ways, in that it feels, and there's more of this that you've seen. It feels significantly more nihilistic, not intended to achieve any particular sort of goal. It feels unfocused and encouraged by other nihilists, and encouraged by really a fairly shallow politics, and like a fairly shallow grounding that is not well considered. I mean, embassy attacks have happened on and off, both here in the United States and abroad, more than once. They've never been successful at anything. They have always had exactly the opposite approach, or I mean, the opposite result that the person committing violence would have hoped for. But this feels even shallower and dumber than that. It's a 1,000-word manifesto posted on Twitter, which doesn't even really explicitly take responsibility so much as deliberately attempt to avoid taking responsibility.
A bit ago, Lowtax asked what it was that the shooter got out of this. And I think that that's really the key to approaching the psychology of this, that the shooter referenced Aaron Bushnell in his manifesto. Aaron Bushnell is the American soldier who self-immolated outside of the Israeli embassy in protest of outside of the Israeli embassy in DC in protest of the war. But I think that the other major strain here is for the frankly adoration and adulation from some quarters that Luigi has gotten after killing the United Healthcare CEO. That these are maybe all young men who felt alienated from people and things in their lives and latched on to something that they saw as a worthy cause, where they could, in one moment, do what they thought was contributing a lifetime to that cause. And that's not a way to fight for a thing. You do much more good by living than you do by burning out in one action, even if that action is well considered and good and the correct action, which none of these were. The end result of what Luigi did in New York is one dead CEO, a whole lot of heightened security budgets for corporations around the world, and probably the life imprisonment of Luigi. The end result of Aaron Bushnell's action is that Aaron Bushnell died in agony, and that he inspired, apparently, the DC shooter to go and kill people as a morally righteous cause. And I would expect that the end result of the shooting in DC is going to be that the shooter goes to jail for the rest of his life, and that two young people who, from all appearances, were broadly aligned with the cause of peace are dead.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Luigi, because, the question applies just as well to Luigi as it does to this guy. What did he accomplish? Nothing. Like, I'm sorry, politics is hard. You have to grind away at it. The people who are remembered in politics are not guys who shot a CEO or shot some staff at an embassy. They're guys who ran for office, pushed a bill through Congress, ran for the presidency, established Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act. These may not be sexy things in the world of, in the terminally brain poisoned world of online, but nevertheless, that's how real change happens. That's how real people's lives are improved. It's not by these stochastic terrorism incidents.
We talk a lot. This podcast hasn't dwelled on it to an excessive degree, but we are going to talk about it. We have talked about it previously, about the broader theme of, quote unquote, the crisis of masculinity in our contemporary culture. And this violent act was one more expression of that larger trend. I think it's important to keep in mind the historical context around violence and how unviolent our society is, which sounds like a crazed thing to say given the mass violence that's currently being perpetrated against immigrant communities by our government, given the violence, the genocide that's underway in Gaza, the large-scale violence in many other forms, both domestically and around the world. But, I was listening to Patrick Wyman's podcast recently, and he was recounting the demographic impact of Hannibal invading Italy during the early during the Roman Republic. 1 in 7 male citizens of military age in Rome were dead after the Battle of Cannae. If we look back to much more recent history, we look at the toll that World War I placed on men specifically in terms of psychology, in terms of raw death and maiming and physical toll. It was a generation gutting experience. And then World War II came 25 years later. 30 years later. Depends how you count it. The men have always had very, very fraught relationships with violence and societal conflict. This is not new. That is not new. How it is expressed has become much more individualized and stochastic, to use that term that we've used a couple times now. That stochastic term just means that there is a randomness and an outsized impact to these events. And I think we need to chew on why these events are taking place, but we also need to remember the broader historical context, whether it's the longest run of human history or even something as recent as a lifetime ago in World War I or half a lifetime ago, using the Weather Underground as an example. This is not a new problem. It is just a new expression in a society that we haven't ever had before. Our society is novel. So I think we just always need to keep that bigger arc in mind when we talk about these issues.
The individual atomization of it to me is a thing that I think is really hard to square with anyone who would kind of consider themselves having any kind of collectivized politics, or general kind of group action, and I don't want to just say socialist because I think that takes it down a very specific ideological direction that I don't necessarily mean.
Yeah, I think you mean. I mean, it would apply to liberals just as much as liberals as we think of them in an American political context, as it would socialists.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the weird sort of lone gunman nature of this is like fundamentally not very different from like school shooter. It's you know, killing these two staffers at the Israeli embassy did nothing to advance the cause of Palestinians. It did nothing to try to raise awareness for what's happening in Gaza. Um, uh, what might be interesting in the future is that I think that there's a real possibility that the Trump administration is going to absolutely overreact here. This falls into newly appointed Janine Pirro's district. And I think I think that the possibility that the Trump administration completely overreacts and behaves extremely badly and overcharges here is probably very likely, which just frankly deepens kind of the tragedy of it, and treats it as a propagandic activity. And probably fails too, and it just makes the entire story sadder.
At this point, we actually do have the first set of charges filed, and I did not think that they were overcharging the crime at this stage of the game. This was something that I was also very worried about, that Pirro would come in guns blazing. But there's still plenty of opportunity for that to happen. There may very well be superseding indictments, but the initial charge is first degree homicide, which I think is substantiated. A couple of guns charges, and there's a DC specific charge related to attacking foreign embassy personnel. They didn't charge hate crimes yet. They might down the road. I think it's just really important that for those of us on the broad left, we try to continue to do what I think we've done a pretty good job on, as we alluded to earlier, for the past many years, of kind of movement hygiene, of trying to keep this sort of thing on the other side of the street. That for me, and I don't know Elias Rodriguez. I read his manifesto, and I still don't really feel like I understand what he believes in that sense. But it seems to me that there is a through line from this lone shooter right wing violence all the way through to Luigi, who was also coming out of a very specific right wing scene, that leads us to this point. And I think we need to do a better job, apparently, of keeping those attitudes and those relaxations in the rules of engagement from metastasizing across the political middle into the left. Because once this stuff takes root, it's very, very hard to get it out. Once you start getting copycats, once you start seeing people who do this kind of thing turned into heroes, that creates imitators. That you see people who have weak attachment to other people and other movements in their life latching on to these acts as something that they can do that will validate, will complete, will redeem their lives. And that's a cycle that can have a lot of repetitions. You can knock over one domino and get a lot of others down there. And one of the things that kind of gets tossed around on Blue Sky is the notion that we might be entering an American Days of Lead, which is a period in Italian history where there were just political shootings all the time. And that's that's a frightening prospect. That's not a better world than the one we live in right now.
Yeah, I think, and adding to what y'all have said, I think the broad left has been much better about coalitional hygiene upkeep, right? And I say that of both the sort of liberal left, establishmentarian sort, as well as the socialist, Bernie AOC left.
Even going further left than that, honestly.
Yeah, even going further left than that. This is a dark road that I don't think we want to be going down. This is, as I said, this is not what we do.
The joke, the line is that your political strategy pales in comparison to mine, which is firebombing a Walmart, and then they don't firebomb a Walmart. We don't want them to firebomb the Walmart. That's actually really important.
And I mean, even firebombing the Walmart, as long as you do it after it's closed, is a real different ball game from going and shooting two people in cold blood. I mean, I think that's important to point out. I think we should also remember too, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably found us through Blue Sky, a posting platform. Just keep in mind when you're liking stuff or replying to stuff or quoting stuff or whatever, you are providing feedback and giving people an incentive to do something. It's the same when you use TikTok. It's the same when you use Instagram. Every interaction, everything you do have agency over both what is being shown to you next and how the people producing that stuff or acting on the incentives that they're getting from these apps, how they make decisions. I don't think that means every decent leftist needs to go out and post their own counter manifesto or decry, the killings or whatever. You don't have to say anything, but just remember when you do say something or when you do interact or whatever you're doing on social media, you are creating an incentive for somebody, and you need to be very careful about what incentive you're creating.
That's why all my posts are good on XD Everything app. And so with the heavy stuff out of the way, let's get on to cutting everybody off Medicaid.
It's an exaggeration. It's an exaggeration, but it's not that dramatic of an exaggeration. We're referring, of course, to the House passing its version of the reconciliation bill that is working its way through the House and Senate on its way to President Trump's desk eventually, presumably. The important thing, I think, before we get to the meat of what's in this bill, everything you're seeing from the House bill is a negotiating position. It is not the final say. The Senate is going to write its own bill. It may have better stuff in it. It may have worse stuff in it. It's going to be different. The Senate and the House then need to get together and hash it out. And we can't say definitively what that final bill is going to look like. We can't say it's going to be better. We can't say it's going to be worse. We just have to acknowledge that this is one step in the process and not the final say. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly is in the bill that came out of the House. So first off, there's tax cuts for people with high incomes and businesses. That works out to almost $4 trillion over 10 years.
No way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's important when you hear, it's just so folks that maybe aren't used to hearing this sort of language. When we say it's 3.8 trillion over 10 years. When we say that, what we mean is relative to current law. It's not actually that much in terms of new tax cuts that they didn't get last year that they will get next year. It's extending prior law tax cuts because the original Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed under President Trump's first term had a 10-year window, and to keep the budget math solid, stuff had to sunset, and they're now fighting to extend those sunsets as opposed to come up with new reductions. It still has a negative impact on the deficit. We shouldn't say necessarily that it doesn't have a cost because it's extending current law. It does, but it's fundamentally different from saying, okay, we were at, let's say 10%, now we're down to 5%. No, it's more like we were at 10%, now we're down to 9.5% is sort of the way to think about it.
Yeah. And I think that one thing that's important to note there is if you're looking at any potential stimulus effect we might get out of this bill, the fact that a lot of it is just keeping existing tax cuts in place is going to mute that stimulus effect. You're not going to get new effects because we're operating under current law.
One other note on that, there's been a lot of economic work done studying how people spend money. The people that spend the most money of new dollars they earn, so if their salary goes up 10%, their spending goes up one amount. It's the lowest part of the income distribution. And it's intuitive why this would be the case. If you are barely making enough to get by or aren't getting by, then a small increase in your income is going to immediately be spent because there's so much stuff that you need to have a decent life. There is so much stuff. If you're higher income, if you get that tax break and you now have a higher income, there's just not that much stuff that you immediately need to run out and buy. Maybe you'll spend more over time, but it's not as big of an imperative. So we call this concept marginal propensity to consume. We are giving large tax cuts to people with a low marginal propensity to consume. So all else equal, if you gave the same amount of money to those people or to lower income people as you are to higher income people in this bill, you would get much more consumer spending and therefore much more economic growth. That is one reason this is an anti-growth economic policy.
I mean, to be fair, we only learned that, 85 years ago?
Give or
90
take.
years ago?
Fortunately, there's all sorts of other weird shit in this bill to talk about. So there is apparently the ability to deduct car loan interest, but only if your car was made in the United States. And I'm curious what you guys think about the efficacy of this as a tax policy.
So this is actually interesting because it contains a significant drafting error. They wanted to give the deduction to people in the calculation of adjusted gross income, which would mean that anybody would be able to claim it without respect to whether they were taking what's called a standardized deduction or not. Basically, higher income people take itemized deductions, lower income people take standardized deductions. That's not an iron law, but it roughly works out that way. So, but they wanted everyone to be able to take advantage of this, so they made it an above the line deduction from annual gross income, as opposed to below the line where you're talking about your standard deduction versus itemized deductions. And then they did the phase out. The way they wrote the phase out in the bill referred to it as what's called below the line deduction, part of those itemized deductions. If implemented into law as currently passed out of the House, it would be the IRS would say, well, we can't implement this. Because it's contradictory. So that's an example of how this bill is absolutely going to change before it passes into law. We don't know exactly how, but it will change. And in part, it's because the drafting sucked on their initial thing, because they did an all-nighter the night before the vote to get this thing out, and many compromises were made and a lot of rush work was done. And that's often the case in Congress, but there are errors all over it.
One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at any of the differences between deductions that only apply if you're itemizing your taxes and deductions that apply if you're taking the standard deduction is that we're down under 10% now of tax filers who itemize. It's a really small piece of the pie in terms of people, but it's a much bigger piece of the pie in terms of money. That the more money you make, the more likely you are to itemize. So in terms of total tax receipts, it's still a pretty good whack. But in terms of people, it's under 10% of the filing population.
There are a bunch of other things in this bill that don't necessarily really relate to tax policy. Medicaid is one example. There are more stringent work requirements. There are changes to benefit payouts. There is an end to gender affirming care, and that may conflict with some state laws. Oregon may be a good example, which I think Go Like Hell Machine has done some work on.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of the way that this was drafted was given very little sort of concern to what existing state laws are already out there, to how existing Medicaid programs are currently administered in each state, because they are administered different in each state. So I looked into Oregon, partially because I live here, but also because Oregon has one of the largest per capita populations of residents on Medicaid in the entire country. And some of what they're planning to push through in the House Republican bill does conflict directly with Oregon state law. So like this will cause problems even if they do get everything through the Senate. And it seems fairly unlikely that they're going to get everything through the Senate.
So there are a couple of issues here with getting what they pass through the House through the Senate. One of the major roadblocks in the way is the parliamentarian. As you may recall from prior reconciliation efforts, including fairly recently and very memorably, the attempt by Democrats to get a minimum wage raise into law through reconciliation. There is a process that is called the Byrd Bath after Senator Robert Byrd, who set out much of the reconciliation process that kicks out provisions that are not directly germane to the budget. This is an arcane process, and there is a lot of disagreement by the pundit class on what's going to stay in and what's going to stay out. But ultimately what happens is the Senate parliamentarian, who is a Senate employee, not a senator, looks at the bill and says, okay, this provision's fine. This provision is not fine. It is possible that the Senate, by a majority vote, can overrule the parliamentarian and elect to keep something in, even though the parliamentarian thinks it's not germane. But my guess is that, well, maybe this is not the time for guessing, but the parliamentarian is going to kick out a number of these social provisions. Exactly which I don't know. We'll find out. But some of these are going to get the axe on that basis, even if they make it through the Senate negotiation process.
But if we throw out the gender affirming care stuff, how are we going to get people to make iPhones in Ohio?
Haven't you read the New York Times recently? We can't make iPhones here because all the slender little fingers are on the hands of Chinese women.
Right. That's right. Our women have King Charles fingers, so we can't do iPhones.
Jesus.
So what else is in this thing? IRA repeal is really going to nuke a ton of investment that took place under President Biden. We have had a massive increase in factory construction in this country over the past 4 years, to a level that is far above anything previously recorded, not even close by a wide margin, not double, but close to double anything previously recorded. And that's adjusting for inflation, of course. The subsidies that were introduced to incentivize all of that factory construction are basically getting zeroed out. It's not zero, but it's very rapid phase out. And some of the conditions that are being put on receiving these subsidies are so onerous that they won't be received at all. That's going to hit not only factories that were spun up to produce batteries, electric vehicles, solar panels, things of this nature, but also the industries that are busy installing massive volumes of solar energy and battery storage across the country. There is a historic boom. Roughly 90% of new U.S. electricity installs are renewables. Coal hasn't been done on a new plant basis in 20 years at this point. Natural gas is a very small share of the total. So you're left with nuclear, which is infrequent. We did have a really large nuclear reactor go online in Georgia last year. But other than that, there's very little nuclear. So it's all renewables. This bill will nuke the investment in any power production, because if you want to build gas, you need turbines, and turbine orders are booked out for the next 5 years. Not just because of U.S. demand, because of global demand. Turbine manufacturers are saying, we're not sure this is going to last because we're going to be outcompeted by solar. It's already basically cheaper to do solar plus storage than it is to do a new gas turbine in this country. And it's going to get a lot cheaper. And so this bill is basically saying, instead of leaning into that trend of lower cost, we're actually going to try and fight against it. And what will end up happening is there's just very little new power production will be built, which is not going to be good for anybody that uses electricity for anything. And that is everybody.
If I can go on a quick tangent here, there was a really cool paper going around the other week about a new underwater battery storage solution. Did you guys see this? That these are these
Is this
gigantic
the spheres? Yeah.
Yes, this is these gigantic concrete spheres that are supposed to go under like a significant depth of water. It's important they be deep because the water pressure needs to be high. That store electricity by using electricity in times of peak solar production to pump water out of the sphere, and then when you want to get the electricity back, you let water back into the sphere, and it rotates a turbine. So you've got these. They've got a working model of this that I want to say it's like a 9-meter sphere, but they're saying that the goal is to get these up to like 50 meters. So just these absolutely gigantic spherical fields of these batteries that are going to sit, I guess, on the seafloor off the California coast or wherever. Anyway, technology's
Wait, did we find a thing that is not just steam for power generation?
Hard to store steam for long periods of time. Although there are really cool batteries out there that involve heating up basically salt to the point that it's molten and letting it sit inside what looks like a shipping container and then releasing it via either photovoltaic or creating steam when you need the power. This is colloquially referred to as the hot box of rocks battery, and it rocks.
So the basic principle of like pump water one place when you have lots of electricity and then let it flow back and turn turbines that's already in use in America. Like, I don't know which lakes you guys are on, but a significant number of the man-made lakes in America are part of these systems that are essentially these gigantic batteries where in times of lots of electricity, they pump water into the high lake and then they let it flow through a hydroelectric dam in times of low electricity. Virginia's got a couple of these that are also pretty nice places to go spend a weekend.
Wait, Virginia's got these, but they still can't pave their roads more than once every 50 years?
I think you may be referring to South Carolina with that joke.
No. It's every other state has bad roads. So Virginia bad, North Carolina good, South Carolina bad, Georgia good. Until you get to Arkansas and Louisiana, and then it's just all bad.
All right. So another thing that this bill includes is exponential increases for ICE, and the amounts that they want to include for ICE are pretty nuts. So looking at like 46 around billion for the wall, apparently, although I think that's going to end up being both the wall and facilities. Around another 5 billion separately for CBP and ICE facilities, 6 billion to hire and train more ICE and CBP officers. These are enormous amounts of money. This is the kind of money that is actually kind of difficult even to spend quickly in terms of trying to actually make all of this happen, particularly when you're looking at a federal government who has kind of gutted its own capacity over the last several months in terms of just the ability to do basic functions like do background checks and check references and everything else that you need in order to hire CBP or ICE agents.
Yeah, it's not like CBP hiring was going great beforehand.
Wait, we're still doing background checks? Like, I mean, didn't that kind of go out the window with Doge?
Yeah, I think the criteria might have changed a little on the background checks. But
The background is they're looking in the background of your X account to see if you have a Pepe there.
There's a freaking guy named whose LinkedIn profile is named Big Balls, who's a neo-Nazi running around, and we're still talking about background checks.
Damn it, Lowtax, he's the best we've got. To jump on what Go Like Hell Machine was saying about the ICE funding. This is really a very anti-immigrant bill across the board, not just in terms of direct enforcement, but we have provisions in there that punish states that have legal immigrants on the Medicaid rolls. Again, that's legal immigrants. That's not undocumented immigrants. That's people who are legally in the country. There's a financial penalty for states covering them. I would be surprised if that survives, but we'll find out. There's a child tax credit that only applies if the taxpayer has an SSN. That is clearly an attempt. And sorry, it only applies if both of the child's parents have an SSN, if memory serves. So it's an attempt to make things to create a child subsidy that's directed exclusively towards the children of two Americans, which is actually not nearly as many parents as you might think.
So if we're looking at this bill is extremely anti-immigrant. It is anti-Medicaid recipients. It's anti-SNAP recipients. It's anti-Medicare recipients. It's anti-lower wage worker recipients. Who does this bill even really benefit? Like what kind of an agenda does this set?
One big winner on this is the crypto industry. One of the immigrant provisions is a 3.5% excise tax on remittances, which is money sent from immigrants to their home country. That excise tax explicitly excludes crypto, which seems almost cartoonish in the degree to which it's a giveaway.
It's all those farm workers in Iowa who are sending Bitcoin back to Honduras, you know.
I mean, they will now, you know, if it's been Western Union before, but it's cheaper to do it in Ethereum or whatever, then that's what they'll do.
Speaking of capital controls, there's also an interesting provision in here that gives the ability to I believe it's Treasury, to strip the tax treaty status of foreign investors that invest in a bunch of different funds that are pretty standard fare in the U.S. So business development companies are one example. REITs are another example. General partner / limited partner funds. What this would do is basically destroy demand for U.S. financial assets of a certain type that tend to be held through those vehicles, and there is no way. I cannot imagine them passing this, because it would destroy the fund management industry in a bunch of very, very painful ways, and it would really blow out credit spreads. Like it would have a really bad impact on that part of the financial markets. And it's in there in an own the overseas libs capacity that is just so blindingly short-sighted. I can't even begin to describe it. In general, a common thread we're seeing across this bill is that we are going to own the libs, and we don't care what we do to economic growth and inflation along the way, because owning the libs is more important. This is without a doubt the most anti-growth, pro-inflation policy mix I have ever seen from a developed country. Nothing else comes close. And if it passes, if a version of the bill from the Senate looks similar, you're talking about upward redistribution of income, destruction of investment, significant damage to financial markets, really bad impacts on labor supply from immigrants, capital controls via taxes on remittances and the situation I just described. This is a nightmare for anyone that cares about economic growth in this country. And there are lots of people who probably listen to this podcast and say, I don't care about economic growth. Well, you probably care about inflation. And from a fiscal policy perspective, this bill is completely bughouse nuts.
So basically, we're making great leaps forward great again.
American Maoism, we love to see it, don't we, folks?
That's right.
That's going to be it for us this Memorial Day weekend. From the shores of Lake Norman in North Carolina, I'm George.
I'm Proctor in DC.
From outer Georgia, I am Lowtax Speedrun Enjoyer.
And from anarchist-controlled Portland, Oregon, I am Go Like Hell Machine.
Thanks for listening. If you have the time or the inclination, we'd love a rating and a review in whatever podcast app you're listening to this in. please feel free to share us on whatever social media floats your boat. We don't care. We're not going to judge you. And we hope you come back next week and keep it normal with us.